The fire had been burning low for a while before Marcus said anything, not low enough to worry about, just low enough that the circle of orange light had pulled itself inward, tightening around us like it was conserving something, like it knew. None of us had spoken for maybe 10 minutes. That's not unusual at a campfire at 2 in the morning. Conversation burns down the same way wood does, in stages, until you're left with coals and quiet. Daniel was poking at the embers with a stick he'd been using since sundown. Renata had her knees pulled up to her chest, chin resting on them, watching the tree line. I was lying on my back on top of my sleeping bag, looking up at a sky so clear and cold it didn't feel like the same sky I saw in the city. The forest was alive then. I want to be specific about that because what came after makes the contrast important. There were crickets, a full, dense carpet of them, the kind that fills the gaps between every other sound, until sound itself seems to be made of them. There were frogs, somewhere deeper in toward the creek we'd crossed that afternoon, a low, irregular chorus that had been going since dusk. There was wind moving through the high branches, the specific sound of pine needles rather than leaves, a dry whisper rather than a rustle. Somewhere to the northwest, every few minutes, an owl had been calling. Not loudly, just consistently, marking time. I remember all of this because I was, at that moment, paying attention to it. Not because I was afraid. Because I was tired and quiet, and the sounds were pleasant, and I was nearly asleep. And then there was the sound. It came from the left. That's the best direction I can give it. Because sound in a forest at night behaves strangely. It bounces off trunks, gets absorbed by undergrowth, comes back at you from angles that don't match its origin. But my first instinct was left. Maybe 60 or 70 feet out, somewhere in the dark between the camp perimeter and where the slope started to drop toward the creek bed. It was a single sound. One beat. A crack, but not quite a crack. The word that keeps coming back to me, even now, is dry. Dry and dense, like something compressed had released all at once, like a joint the size of a door. Daniel stopped moving his stick. Renata lifted her chin off her knees. Marcus, who had been half asleep in his camp chair with a jacket folded over his lap, opened his eyes. None of us said anything. That's one of those moments you recognize in hindsight as significant. We all heard it, we all responded to it, and not one of us immediately made it smaller with a joke or a casual explanation. We just went still. The sound had done something to the air, and we were waiting to see what followed it. What followed it was nothing, and then the forest went quiet. I've thought about how to describe this many times. It's harder than it sounds, which is part of the problem. The cricket sound didn't stop the way crickets stop when you walk through a field. That ripple effect, that spreading silence that moves with you, this was simultaneous. The full carpet of them everywhere at once, like a switch. And it wasn't just the crickets. The frogs cut out in the same instant. The wind, which I know doesn't work this way and can't be explained that way, seemed to pull back. Even the fire made less sound. Or I stopped being able to hear it over the ringing in my ears that was just my own blood, my own pulse, suddenly very loud. The owl did not call again. None of us moved for what I'm sure was 30 seconds, but felt much longer. I was still on my back. I turned my head left, toward the trees, though I couldn't see anything beyond the first few feet where the firelight reached. Beyond that was just dark. Not the dark you get in a city or suburb where your eyes adjust quickly and you can eventually make out shapes and outlines. This was forest dark, solid, the kind that pushes back. "What was that?" Renata said, and her voice was quiet, barely above a murmur, the way you talk when you're trying not to disturb something. "Probably a branch," Daniel said. He said it too quickly and with too much certainty, which meant he didn't believe it either. Marcus said nothing. He was looking at the trees. We had come up on a Thursday, which meant no other campers in a 6-site radius. The ranger station was 11 miles by road, 4.5 by trail. We had a truck parked at the trailhead, a 2-mile walk from camp. We had cell phones with no signal, a hand-crank emergency radio we hadn't needed, 2 headlamps and a flashlight between 4 people. We'd been camping together for years, all of us in our late 20s, all of us the kind of people who laugh at the idea of being scared in a forest. I want to establish this because it's relevant to how we responded. We were not credulous people. We were not jumpy. We had camped in places more remote than this one, and the forest had made plenty of strange sounds over the years. A bear crashing through brush 40 feet away that one time, which had been terrifying and immediate and resolved itself in about 4 seconds. Strange lights on a trail in Vermont that turned out to be a lost mountain biker with a headlamp. The sounds that forests make at night that you can never quite classify, that you eventually just learn to accept as the forest doing what forests do. This was different. We all knew it was different, not because the sound had been so unusual, but because of what came after it. The silence was wrong. That's the only way to put it. Silence has textures. A lull between cicada calls is different from the silence of early morning, is different from the silence between songs on a long drive. This silence had a texture I'd never encountered before, and I've turned the words over many times since, and the closest I can get is held. The forest felt held, like something in it was holding its breath. Marcus got up from his chair. He walked to the edge of the firelight without saying anything. Not into the trees, just to that threshold where the light gave out, where the orange glow dissolved into dark. He stood there with his back to us for a moment, not moving. "Marcus," I said. "Yeah." "What are you doing?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at something, or looking for something, or just standing at the edge of the visible world, the way you sometimes do when you feel like something needs acknowledging. "Listening," he said. And he was right too, because that was the thing about the silence. It warranted listening to. It wasn't empty. I know that sounds like a contradiction. The absence of sound was itself a kind of sound, a pressure that occupied the same space, and the longer it went on, the more it demanded attention. It had been 2 minutes now, maybe 3. The crickets do not stay silent for 3 minutes. They don't. I've spent enough time outdoors to know this with confidence. A disturbance will quiet them for 30 seconds, a minute at most. Then they resume. They did not resume. Daniel had put down his stick. He was sitting forward in his chair, with his elbows on his knees, looking at his hands. "It's still quiet," he said, "not really to any of us." "Yeah," Renata said. "It's been—" He checked his watch. An old analog thing he wore camping because it didn't need charging. "It's been almost 4 minutes." Marcus came back from the edge and sat down. He sat differently than he had before, leaning forward instead of back, both feet flat on the ground. We didn't say much after that. We just waited. 5 minutes. 6. The fire settled, and the sound of it settling, that subtle collapse of carbon, that sigh, was loud in a way fire sounds never are when there's anything else to hear. I sat up from my sleeping bag and added a piece of wood without thinking about it. I wasn't cold, I just wanted the fire to be bigger. At some point, Daniel said quietly, "It's like they heard something we didn't." Nobody argued with this. Renata said, "Or they heard the same thing we did, and it meant something different to them." This conversation, such as it was, trails off in my memory. We didn't talk much, partly because of the sound protocol that fear installs in you without your permission. The directive to be quiet, to make less noise, to reduce your footprint, and partly because none of us had anything useful to say. The silence continued, the firelight held, the darkness beyond it held also. 7 minutes, 8. I was watching the tree line, specifically the left side, where the sound had come from. I had been watching it steadily enough that I'd started to see shapes in the dark that I knew weren't there. The pattern recognition function of the human brain, filling in the absence of information with suggestions of form. A darkness slightly darker than the surrounding dark, a shape that might be a trunk or might be something standing beside a trunk. I looked away and looked back, and the shapes rearranged themselves differently, meaninglessly. At 9 minutes, the crickets came back, not all at once, the way they'd stopped. They resumed gradually from the right side first, then from behind us, then from further off in the direction of the creek. A slow patching, as if sound were returning to a map quadrant by quadrant. By 12 or 13 minutes from the initial sound, the noise floor of the forest had returned to something close to normal. The frogs resumed. The wind came back through the pines. The owl did not call again that night. We sat for a long time without discussing what had happened. There's a particular kind of silence between people who've just experienced the same thing and don't know how to categorize it. It has a different quality than ordinary quiet, a kind of careful mutual avoidance, as if naming the experience will make it more real than leaving it unnamed. Around 2:40. Marcus said he was going to bed, and we all moved with him almost gratefully toward our tents. Nobody made the usual jokes about brushing teeth or not stepping on anyone's guy lines. We just moved. I zipped my tent closed behind me and lay in the dark, listening. The crickets were still going. The frogs were still going. Normal, all normal. I don't know when I fell asleep. I don't think it was quickly. In the morning it was fine. That's what makes this difficult to talk about. Or maybe what makes it easy, depending on how you look at it. Morning in that forest was genuinely beautiful. Low light coming through the pines at a long angle, mist sitting in the lower areas near the creek, birds. Everything that had been dark and charged the night before was ordinary now, sunlit and ordinary. We made coffee and ate breakfast, and none of us brought up the previous night for the better part of an hour. Then Daniel said, over his second cup, "So, last night?" "Yeah," Renata said. 9 minutes. "Yeah." "Did we—" He stopped. He turned his cup in his hands. "Did we think about what might have made a sound loud enough to—" "A lot of things," Marcus said, not dismissively, just factually, the way you state something you've already worked through. Branch failure, rock, tree coming down somewhere further off than it sounded. None of those would— "No," Marcus said. "Probably not." That was it. That was the extent of our analysis in the morning, which felt almost comically inadequate given the 9 minutes of absolute silence that had followed a single dry sound in the dark. But there's something about daylight that makes the previous night's fear seem faintly embarrassing, faintly disproportionate, and you pull back from it the way you pull back from anything that made you feel vulnerable. We hiked out that afternoon. The drive home was 4 hours, and we talked the whole way about other things. I've been back to that campsite twice since then. The first time was with Daniel, about 8 months later. We didn't talk about the previous trip. We had a good weekend. The forest was fine. The second time I went alone, which is unusual for me. I'm not typically someone who camps solo. I went on a Thursday again. Same site, and I set up camp and made a fire and sat with it until well past midnight, listening. Nothing happened. The crickets went all night. The frogs went all night. At some point, an owl called from the northwest, and I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't been aware was tight. I told myself it was resolved, that I'd gone back and faced it, and the forest had been normal, and whatever I'd been carrying from that night was discharged. I'm not sure I believe that, because the thing I keep returning to isn't the 9 minutes of silence, though that's the part that other people latch onto when I tell the story. It's the moment just before, the 30 seconds or so between the sound and the silence, when we were all still and waiting to hear what came next. In that window I turned my head left, toward the trees. and I had the specific and complete and entirely unwelcome sensation that something in the dark had already turned to look back. I've talked to a few people who've had experiences with sudden mass silence in forests, biologists, birders, people who spend a lot of time outdoors professionally. They have explanations, predator proximity, they say. When a significant predator enters a zone, prey animals and even non-prey species go silent as a threat response. The silence itself becomes information that propagates outward, species to species, each animal reading the absence of sound from its neighbors as a signal to add its own absence. It can produce an apparently simultaneous hush across a wide area, even though it's technically a cascade. This is a real thing. This happens. I believe it. What I find harder to fit into that framework is the duration. 9 minutes is long. Predator-induced silence typically resolves when the predator either reveals itself, takes prey, charges, retreats, or moves far enough away that the sound-dampening gradient dissipates. The animal behavior literature I've found suggests most such events resolve in under 3 minutes for common predators. For uncommon ones, large bears, mountain lions in unusual contexts, perhaps longer. 5-6 minutes in extreme cases, 9 is long. And then there's the other thing, the thing I've mentioned only to Marcus, and which he heard without expression and nodded at and did not contradict. When I stood up to put wood on the fire, around the 6-minute mark, when I moved without thinking, just wanting the fire to be bigger, I looked down and noticed that my hands were doing the thing hands do when a body is afraid and the mind hasn't caught up yet. They were shaking. Not much. Just slightly. The kind of tremor you don't feel until you see it. I hadn't been aware of being afraid. That's the part that stays with me. I had been sitting there thinking myself calm, thinking myself analytical and steady and reasonable, and my hands had known something my mind hadn't admitted yet. Whatever was out there in the dark beyond the firelight, whatever had come close enough to silence 9 minutes of a living forest, my body had registered it before I had, and it had stayed. Marcus texted me about 7 months after the solo trip. Out of nowhere, which is unusual for him. We're not heavy texters, neither of us. The message came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which is also unusual. It just said, "Do you ever think about the thing that didn't make a second sound?" I stared at it for a long time. I wrote back, "Yeah," he wrote, like it knew once was enough. I put down my phone. I got up and checked that my apartment door was locked, which is not something I normally do at midnight. And then I stood in my kitchen for a while in the dark, without turning on the light, listening to the sounds of the building. The heat in the pipes, a television through the wall, someone's footsteps on the floor above me. Normal sounds. All normal. I went back to my phone and wrote, "Don't text me about this at midnight." He sent back a single character, a period. I understood what he meant. There's a thing that happens to people who spend a lot of time outdoors, which is that you develop a sense for when a space is occupied and when it isn't. Not a mystical sense, just calibration. You start to read the texture of an environment, the behavior of the animals in it, the way the air moves, the way sound distributes itself. You get a feel for whether you're alone in a place or whether something else is present somewhere in it. That night, after the sound, after the silence went on too long, and then slowly